Bullies mock an African-American man, not knowing it was Shaquille O'Neal. The gun felt impossibly heavy in Eleanor's hand as she aimed it at Shaquille, the man who had once been everything to her. Her fingers trembled against the cold metal, and she could feel sweat trickling down her spine, despite the autumn chill that permeated the abandoned warehouse. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting fractured shadows across his face, a face she had once memorized with loving fingertips, now twisted with an emotion she couldn't name. "You don't have to do this," Shaquille said, his voice steady despite the weapon pointed at his chest. He took a cautious step forward, hands raised slightly. "Whatever you think you know, don't." The word escaped her like shattered glass. "Don't you dare tell me what I know or don't know. I found the files, Shaquille. I found everything." His eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once looked at her with such warmth, darkened. A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only indication that her words had landed. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the metal roof in an erratic rhythm that matched her heartbeat. 15 years, she whispered, her voice gaining strength. 15 years I've been married to a stranger. The manila envelope she'd brought lay open on the floor between them, its contents, photographs, bank statements, identity documents, scattered like fallen leaves. Evidence of a life she hadn't known existed until 3 days ago. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture so achingly familiar it made her chest hurt. "You weren't supposed to find out. Not like this." Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. "That's the thing about lies, Shaquille. They always find their way to the surface." From somewhere in the darkness behind her came the sound of sirens, distant but approaching. Time was running out for both of them. "You have a choice to make," Shaquille said, his gaze never leaving hers. "But before you do, there's something you need to understand." The gun weighed heavier with each passing second. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, a house with a garden where sunflowers grew in summer. All of it built on a foundation of secrets she was only beginning to uncover. "I'm listening," she said, and realized with sudden clarity that despite everything, some part of her still hoped for an explanation that could make sense of the wreckage their life had become. Shaquille took a deep breath, and as he began to speak, the look in his eyes told her that whatever came next would change everything between them forever. 5 years earlier, Eleanor O'Neal loved Sunday mornings in Laurel Heights. The small Massachusetts town came alive in a leisurely sort of way. Families walking to the local diner for breakfast, elderly couples strolling hand in hand through the town square, the bookshop owner arranging new releases in the window display. At 42, Eleanor had found her rhythm in this place, balanced between her work as the town's only veterinarian and her role as wife and mother. "Mom, can Jamie come over later to work on our science project?" 12-year-old Sophie asked, her attention divided between her cereal and the tablet propped against the juice carton. "As long as your room gets cleaned first," Eleanor replied, pouring coffee into her husband's favorite mug, the chipped blue, one with World's Okayest Dad, that their son had given him 3 Christmases ago. Shaquille appeared in the kitchen doorway, freshly showered and dressed in his weekend uniform of jeans and a faded Harvard sweatshirt. At 47, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. The silver threading through his dark hair only enhanced his professor's demeanor, thoughtful, measured, kind. "Morning," he said, kissing her cheek before taking the offered coffee. "Remind me what time Ben's game starts today." 2 o'clock, their 14-year-old son answered from the kitchen table, not looking up from his phone. "Coach wants us there by 1:30. Eleanor watched her family with a contentment that had been hard-won. The early years of her marriage had been marked by struggle, Shaquille's demanding schedule as a political science professor, her veterinary residency, the difficult pregnancies. But they'd weathered it all, building a life that, while not perfect, felt solid and true. "I've got papers to grade before the game," Shaquille said, leaning against the counter. "Shouldn't take more than a couple hours. I'll drop Sophie at her friend's house on my way to run errands," Eleanor replied, already mentally reorganizing her day. This was their dance, the give and take of shared responsibilities, the rhythm of a marriage in its comfortable middle years. Later that afternoon, cheering from the bleachers as Ben's baseball team took the field, Eleanor found herself studying her husband's profile. The way sunlight caught in his hair, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the familiar curve of his mouth as he shouted encouragement to their son. 15 years of marriage. And still, there were moments when looking at him made her chest tighten with a rush of feeling. "What?" Shaquille asked, catching her gaze. "Nothing," she smiled. "Just thinking how lucky I am." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture as familiar as her own heartbeat. "The lucky one is me." It wasn't until 3 days later that the first hairline crack appeared in the foundation of their life together. Eleanor was in Shaquille's study, searching for a book he'd mentioned might help Sophie with her report on constitutional amendments, when she noticed the blinking message light on his office phone. Without thinking, she pressed play, expecting to hear a colleague's voice discussing department politics, or a student requesting an extension on an assignment. Instead, a woman's voice filled the room, speaking in a language Eleanor didn't recognize. Something Eastern European, perhaps Russian or Polish. The only word she understood was Shaquille, spoken with a familiarity that made her pause. The message continued for nearly a minute before ending abruptly. Curious but not concerned, Eleanor mentioned it over dinner that night. "You had a message today, a woman speaking what sounded like Russian. I didn't understand it." Shaquille's fork paused halfway to his mouth, suspended for just a fraction of a second before continuing its journey. Anyone else might have missed it, but Eleanor knew her husband's rhythms too well. "Probably Elena from the International Studies program," he said smoothly. "She's been trying to recruit me for a panel on Eastern European politics. I'll call her back tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, the moment already forgotten, as Sophie launched into a dramatic retelling of middle school drama. But later that night, lying awake beside her sleeping husband, Eleanor found herself replaying the slight hesitation, the too casual explanation. It was nothing, she told herself. And yet, the next morning, she found herself doing something she'd never done before. Checking Shaquille's call history on their shared cell phone account, Eleanor from International Studies had never called. In fact, the only calls from the university that month had been from Shaquille's department chair, and a number listed as the faculty lounge. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor noticed other small discrepancies. A weekend conference in New York, that wasn't listed on the university's public calendar. A credit card charge at a restaurant in Boston on a night Shaquille had said he was working late on campus. Missing hours she couldn't account for. "You're being ridiculous," she chided herself. Shaquille had never given her reason to doubt him. He was devoted to their family, engaged with their children, present in their marriage. And yet, the tiny inconsistencies collected in the back of her mind, pebbles gathering until they couldn't be ignored. It was Sophie who inadvertently provided the key that unlocked everything. Struggling with her social studies homework one evening, she asked, "Dad, can you help me with this Cold War stuff? We're supposed to explain why it wasn't actually a war." "Your father's at his faculty meeting," Eleanor reminded her. Sophie frowned. "But I just saw him downtown when Jamie's mom drove us home from soccer. He was talking to some lady outside that new coffee place." Eleanor kept her voice casual. "Are you sure it was Dad?" Sophie rolled her eyes with all the disdain a 12-year-old could muster. "I think I know what my own father looks like." That night, after both children were asleep, Eleanor sat in her car 2 blocks from their home, her heart hammering against her ribs as she made a decision that would change everything. She would follow Shaquille the next time he had a late meeting. Just once, to prove to herself that her suspicions were unfounded, born of insecurity or middle-aged anxiety or too many procedural dramas on television. But when she followed him 3 days later, Shaquille didn't go to the university. Instead, he drove to a nondescript office building in a commercial district 20 miles away. Through the plate glass window, Eleanor watched as her husband greeted a stern-looking man in a suit with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. The man handed Shaquille a thick manila envelope, which he tucked inside his jacket before disappearing deeper into the building. Eleanor waited 2 hours for him to emerge, her mind racing through possibilities, each more improbable than the last. An affair seemed almost quaint compared to the alternatives her imagination now supplied. When Shaquille finally reappeared, his expression was grave, his movements precise in a way she'd never noticed before. She followed him to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, waited until he drove away, then approached the office with a story about her husband forgetting the unit number. O'Neill. The attendant frowned at his computer screen. No O'Neill. Listed, ma'am. He might have used his other name, Eleanor improvised, heart pounding. For his work. Shaquille Petrov. The attendant shook his head. No Petrov either. Only person been here in the last hour, rents under the name Alexei Petrov, Unit 217. The ground seemed to shift beneath Eleanor's feet. She mumbled her thanks and retreated to her car, hands shaking so badly she dropped her keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Alexei Petrov, a name she'd never heard, attached to her husband of 15 years. That night, she waited until Shaquille was asleep, before slipping from their bed and making her way to his study. It took her less than 10 minutes to find the false bottom in his desk drawer. Inside was a passport, not Shaquille's familiar navy blue American passport, but a maroon one with Cyrillic lettering on the cover. Inside was her husband's face, next to a name she couldn't read. The next morning, she called in sick to the clinic and drove to Boston to the office building she'd followed Shaquille to. It took all her courage to approach the receptionist, a severe-looking woman with platinum blonde hair. "I need to speak with someone about Shaquille O'Neill," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Or Alexei Petrov, whichever name he's using today." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. We don't have anyone by either name working here." "Please," Eleanor leaned forward. "I'm his wife, his real wife, and I need to know who my husband is." After a long moment, the receptionist picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it. 2 minutes later, Eleanor was escorted to a small conference room where a middle-aged man in a tailored suit waited. "Mrs. O'Neill," he said, not bothering to introduce himself. "You're making a serious mistake." "The mistake was mine 15 years ago," she replied, surprising herself with her steadiness. "When I married a man who doesn't exist." The warehouse felt colder now, the rain falling harder outside. Eleanor's arm ached from holding the gun, but she couldn't lower it. Not yet. "After I confronted them," she said, "they offered me money to keep quiet, as if that's all our life together was worth." Shaquille, or whoever he really was, shook his head. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like," she demanded. "Tell me who you really are." He took a deep breath, and for the first time since she'd known him, Eleanor saw his carefully constructed facade crack. "My name was Alexei Petrov. I was KGB, then FSB after the Soviet Union fell. In 2002, I was tasked with establishing a deep cover identity in the United States to monitor certain political developments. And I was just part of your cover," Eleanor said, the words bitter on her tongue. "At first," he admitted. "But Eleanor, you have to believe me. What grew between us was real. The life we built, the family we created, that wasn't fiction. How can I believe anything you say? Because 5 years ago I made a choice." His voice grew urgent. "When Sophie was sick, remember? That winter when she had pneumonia and we thought we might lose her? I contacted my handlers and told them I was done. I'd been sending them increasingly irrelevant information for years by then, but watching our daughter fight for her life," he swallowed hard. "I couldn't live the lie anymore." "They let you just walk away?" Eleanor's disbelief was palpable. "No. They threatened me, threatened you and the kids. That's when I went to the Americans. Made a deal. I've been working with US intelligence ever since, feeding misinformation back to Moscow while providing real intelligence to the CIA." The sirens were closer now, wailing through the rain. The man you saw me meet, he's my handler. American, not Russian. The storage unit contains emergency supplies and documentation in case we ever need to disappear. Quickly. To protect you and the children. Eleanor's hand trembled violently now, tears blurring her vision. Why should I believe you? Because I had 1,000 chances to leave and never did. Because when I had to choose between the country I was born to serve and the family I grew to love, I chose you. Every time I chose you. A crash sounded from the far end of the warehouse, agents breaking in, coming for them both. You have about 30 seconds to decide, Shaquille said softly. If you truly believe I've been lying about loving you for 15 years, then pull the trigger. I deserve it. But if there's even a small part of you that really knows what we have is real, then we need to get out of here. Together. In that moment, with flashlight beams cutting through the darkness toward them, Eleanor saw not the spy or the liar, but the man who had held her through 2 difficult childbirths, who knew exactly how she took her coffee, who still looked at her across crowded rooms as if she were the only person who mattered. The gun isn't loaded, she said, lowering it at last. I couldn't, even when I thought. Relief flooded his features, and in that unguarded moment, she saw the truth she'd been searching for. Whatever his name had been, whoever he had served, the love between them had been real. We have children, she said, her voice breaking. What happens to them? We protect them together, but we have to go now. As the agents closed in, Shaquille took her hand, the same hand that had held a gun to his chest moments before, and led her toward a hidden exit he'd clearly scouted in advance. I don't know if I can forgive you, she whispered as they slipped into the rainy night. He turned to her, his face illuminated briefly by a distant streetlight. I know, but I'll spend the rest of my life earning back your trust if you'll let me try. Behind them, the warehouse erupted with activity, shouts, radios crackling, flashlight beams sweeping the darkness. But they were already moving through the shadows, hand in hand toward an uncertain future that, despite everything, they would face together. 3 months later, in a small coastal town in Oregon, Eleanor sat on the porch of a rental house, watching the Pacific Ocean crash against the rocky shore. The children were inside, adapting to their new reality with the resilience of youth. New names, new school, new beginning. They knew only that their father's work had necessitated the move, that some people wanted to hurt him because of information he possessed. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. The screen door creaked, and Shaquille, she still thought of him by that name, the name of the man she had loved, joined her on the porch swing. Ben's teacher called. He said, "He's adjusting well, top of his math class already." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Their son had always been academically gifted like his father. The thought no longer carried the sting it once had. "And you?" Shaquille asked carefully. "How are you adjusting?" She considered the question seriously. The anger still flared sometimes, the sense of betrayal. But alongside it grew something else, a tentative understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. "I'm learning who we are now," she said finally. "Who you are, who I am, knowing what I know." He nodded, respecting the honesty of her answer. After a moment, he reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her space to pull away. She didn't. "I meant what I said that night," he told her. "It was real. It is real." Eleanor looked out at the ocean, vast and changeable and deep, like truth, like love. Like the complex, imperfect man beside her, whom she was choosing, eyes wide open this time, to continue loving. "I know," she said, and tightened her fingers around his. "That's why we're here." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across their temporary home, Eleanor recognized that some questions might never be fully answered, some wounds never completely healed. But in choosing to rebuild rather than retreat, she had found a strength in herself she hadn't known existed, a capacity for understanding that transcended simple notions of truth and deception. Their life together would never be what it was before. But as the last light of day gilded the water and Shaquille's shoulder pressed warm against hers, Eleanor understood that sometimes The breaking of something old created space for something new to grow. Something harder won and more precious for having nearly been lost.